British countryside is pockmarked with commemorative plaques and statues, marking the site of battles which were fought long ago. Though most of these battles were of strategic importance, there are only a handful in which changed the fate of a nation. One battle in particular would see the end of a dynasty stretching back hundreds of years and giving rise to a dynasty which named a period of British history. And it all happened at the Battle of Bosworth Field. During the 15th century, the civil war known as the Wars of the Roses raged across England as the houses of York and Lancaster fought each other for the English throne. In 1471, the Yorkists defeated their rivals in the battles of Barnet and Tewkesbury. The Lancastrian King Henry VI and his only son, Edward of Westminster, died in the aftermath at the Battle of Tewkesbury. Their deaths left the House of Lancaster with no direct claimants to the throne. The Yorkist King, Edward IV, was in complete control of England. Richard III had loyally fought beside his brother, and though he was small, slender, and did not have the robust physique associated with many of his Plantagenet predecessors, his performance on the battlefield impressed his brother greatly, and he became Edward's right-hand man. From a young age, Richard enjoyed rough sports and activities that were considered manly at the time. Edward IV died on the 9th of April 1483, and his 12-year-old son succeeded him as Edward V, but his reign would be short. Edward V was declared illegitimate, and Richard ascended to the throne. Edward and his younger brother Richard soon disappeared, and their fate is a hotly debated mystery to this day. In contrast to Richard III, Henry Tudor was unfamiliar with warfare and was a stranger to the land he intended to rule over. He spent the first 14 years of his life in Wales and the next 14 in Brittany and France. Henry was slender but strong and decisive, though he lacked a desire for battle and was not much of a warrior. Chroniclers and ambassadors of the time found him more interested in commerce and finance. Recognising that he was not a military man, Henry appointed several experienced veterans to command his army. John de Vere, the 13th Earl of Oxford, was Henry's principal military commander, a veteran from the Battle of Barnet in 1471. Henry's first attempt to invade England in 1483 foundered in a storm, but his second would be more successful. 30 ships sailed from Harfleur on the 1st of August, and with fair winds behind them, landed in his native Wales at Mill Bay on the north side of Milford Haven on the 7th of August 1485. Henry may have hoped for support from the locals, especially as he was of Welsh ancestry, but he received a muted response. No joyous welcome awaited him on shore, and only a few individual Welshmen joined his army as it marched inland. Eventually, Henry's army was reinforced by the retinue under Rhys ap Thomas, which has been estimated at 500 or 2,000 men. News of Henry's landing reached Richard on the 11th of August, but it took 3 to 4 days for his messengers to notify his lords of their king's mobilisation. On the 16th of August, the Yorkist army started to gather at Leicester. Although London was his goal, Henry did not move directly towards the city. After resting in Shrewsbury, his forces went eastwards and picked up Sir Gilbert Talbot and other English allies, including deserters from Richard's forces. Although its size had increased substantially since the landing, Henry's army was still considerably outnumbered by Richard's forces. Henry's pace through Staffordshire was slow, delaying the confrontation with Richard so that he could gather more recruits to his cause. Henry had been communicating with the Stanleys for some time before setting foot in England, and the Stanleys had mobilised their forces on hearing of Henry's landing. Thomas Stanley was married to Henry's mother, Margaret Beaufort, and it is believed that she played a key role in their relationship. The Stanleys were notorious for always being on the winning side, and often put one brother on one side and the other on the opposing side. Thomas, therefore, would not outright declare for Henry. The Stanleys ranged their army ahead of Henry's march through the English countryside, meeting twice in secret with Henry as he moved through Staffordshire. At the second of these meetings, Henry was warned that Richard's forces were not far off. On the 21st of August, the Stanleys were making camp on the slope of the hill north of Dadlington, while Henry encamped his army at Whitemoors to the northwest of their camp. Richard hurriedly marched his troops from Leicester and encamped close to Henry's army near Ambion Hill, south to the town of Market Bosworth in Leicestershire. The Yorkist army, estimated at between 7,500 and 12,000 men, deployed on the hilltop along the ridgeline from west to east and split into 3 contingents, or battles as they were known. Richard's right flank was under the command of John Howard, the 1st Duke of Norfolk. This force consisted of spearmen, a cannon, and about 1,200 archers. Richard himself commanded the centre, which comprised of 3,000 infantry, and Henry Percy, the 4th Earl of Northumberland, commanded his left flank with a force of approximately 4,000 men, many of them mounted. From this commanding position, Richard could see the Stanleys' army holding positions around Dadlington Hill, while to the southwest was Henry's army. Henry himself had an army estimated between 5,000 and 8,000 men, which was split into 2 battles. The bigger of the 2 was commanded by John de Vere, the 13th Earl of Oxford, while Henry commanded a much smaller battle. The battle began by the exchanging of artillery fire, where Richard soon got the upper hand. Henry sent messengers to Stanley, asking him to join his side. The reply was evasive, thus Henry had no choice but to confront Richard's forces alone. Richard also sent a message to Stanley, threatening to execute his son if he did not join in on the attack on Henry immediately. Stanley's cold reply was that he had other sons. Richard ordered Stanley's son execution, but it was never carried out. Thus Lord Stanley watched and waited. Henry's army was harassed by Richard's artillery as they manoeuvred around a vast marsh to the east of their position. Once Oxford and his men were clear of the marsh, Norfolk's battle and several contingents of Richard's group, under the command of Sir Robert Brackenbury, started the advance. Hails of arrows showered both sides as they closed. Oxford men proved the steadier in the ensuing hand-to-hand combat. They held their ground, and several of Norfolk's men fled the field. Seeing that his force was slowly being driven back, Richard signalled for Northumberland to assist, but his battle showed no sign of movement. Historians believe that Northumberland chose not to aid his king for personal reasons, though others have suggested that the Earl would have to either go through his allies or execute a wide flanking move, near impossible to perform given the standard of drill at the time. It was around this point in the battle that Richard saw Henry at some distance behind his main force, and decided to end the fight quickly by killing the enemy commander. He led a charge of mounted men around the melee and tore into Henry's group. Several accounts state that Richard's force numbered 800 to 1,000 knights, but it was more likely that Richard was accompanied only by his household men and closest friends. Richard himself killed Henry's standard-bearer Sir William Brandon in the initial charge, and unhorsed burly John Shane, Edward IV's former standard-bearer, with a blow to the head from his broken lance. The French mercenaries in Henry's retinue related how the attack had caught them off guard, and that Henry sought protection by dismounting and concealing himself among them to present less of a target. Henry made no attempt to engage in combat himself. The remainder of Henry's bodyguard surrounded their master and succeeded in keeping him away from the Yorkist king. Meanwhile, seeing Richard embroiled with Henry's men and separated from his main force, Thomas Stanley made his move and rode to the aid of Henry. Now outnumbered, Richard's group was surrounded and gradually pressed back. Richard's force was driven several hundred yards away from Henry, near to the edge of a marsh into which the king's horse toppled. Richard, now unhorsed, gathered himself and rallied his dwindling followers, supposedly refusing to retreat, saying, "God forbid that I retreat one step. I will either win the battle as a king, or die as one." Polydore Virgil, Henry Tudor's official historian, recorded that King Richard, alone, was killed fighting manfully in the thickest press of his enemies. Richard had come within a sword's length of Henry Tudor before being surrounded by William Stanley's men and killed. The Burgundian chronicler Jean Molinet says that a Welshman struck the death blow with a halberd while Richard's horse was stuck in the marshy ground. It was said that the blows were so violent that the king's helmet was driven into his skull. Analysis of King Richard's skeletal remains found 11 wounds, 9 of them to the head. A blade consistent with a halberd had sliced off part of the rear of Richard's skull, suggesting he had lost his helmet. After the battle, Richard's circlet is said to have been found and brought to Henry, who was proclaimed king at the top of Crown Hill, near the village of Stoke Golding. It is important to note that Henry never claimed the throne by rights of his lineage, as that was flimsy at best, but by right of conquest. Casualties for the battle are relatively low when compared to others in the Wars of the Roses. The Lancastrians lost 100 men, while the Yorkist losses were around 1,000, but these numbers are likely to be an exaggeration. The bodies of the fallen were brought to St James's Church in Dadlington for burial. However, Henry denied any immediate rest for Richard. Instead, the last Yorkist king's corpse was stripped naked and strapped across a horse. His body was brought to Leicester and openly exhibited to prove that he was dead. After 2 days, the corpse was interred in a plain tomb within the church of Greyfriars. The church was demolished following the friars' dissolution in 1538, and the location of Richard's tomb was long uncertain. On the 12th of September 2012, archaeologists announced the discovery of a buried skeleton with spinal abnormalities and head injuries under a car park in Leicester, which after DNA testing turned out to be Richard III. Historians consider the Battle of Bosworth Field to mark the end of the Plantagenet dynasty and medieval England, making it one of the most defining moments of English history.